great English writer G.K. Chesterton, just a master of the English language, he had a lot of great one-liners. And one of them, he said that if you want to get to a place where you have enough, there's two ways to get there. Two ways to get to a place where you have enough. That is to accumulate more and more, or to desire less. Accumulate more or desire less. Now, I'm not one to add to anything that G.K. Chesterton said. He's smarter and holier than me. But I will kind of add this little bit. And that is that when we have gratitude, when we are really grateful, our desire for more stuff, for more and more and more, it goes down. In order to desire less, we ought to be grateful more. The gospel today, these 10 lepers. Leprosy, if you're not familiar, it's now today called Hansen's disease. It's just an incredibly horrible thing. It's very painful. It's contagious. It disfigures the body. It would be a horrible, horrible, horrible thing to have. And so these 10 lepers, they meet Jesus. They walk up to him with leprosy, and they walk home without it. So one would think this would be the single greatest day of their life. I woke up this morning with a terrible disease, and by noon it was gone. And so we would say, well, however that happened, in this case, Jesus healed them. Boy, our first response ought to be to go to the guy who healed you and at least say thank you. But what we're told in the gospel today is that one of them did. 1 out of 10. 1 out of 10. Now, if you're like me, maybe you're not, I'm not sure I would be the one. Sometimes I look at the blessings in my own life, and I think to myself, I don't know if I would be the one. We could easily look at the 9 who didn't go back and say, those ungrateful. Can you believe those guys? What is wrong with them? And then when we look at our own lives, we realize, okay, I'm not as grateful for what I have as I should be. We oftentimes lack gratitude. We oftentimes do not thank God enough for all that God has done for us. Now, this is not to say that our lives are perfect. I can look around this church, I can look at my own life and say, life is far from where I maybe want it to be. Life is far from perfect. Many of you are going through very difficult times. Hardships, physical, mental, spiritual. So this is not to say that somehow gratitude brings perfection. But what gratitude does do, a life lived with gratitude, thanking God as often as possible for what God has done and is doing for us, is it makes us desire less. We're always wanting to accumulate more. Gratitude lessens that desire. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have career aspirations. Doesn't mean you don't want to graduate. Doesn't mean you're not working for that promotion at work. All of that can be good. But when we really look at our lives and we really kind of take stock, it's my hope that our hearts are just filled to the brim with gratitude because of all that God has done and is doing for us. That you're here this morning, the very life that you've been given, the ability to come and to pray, your family, your job, your community. There are a ton of things for which to be grateful. Now, in this parish, we are entering in, this is week number 1 of what we call our annual stewardship renewal. Let me just define that word, stewardship. And this applies, some of you are visiting here today, some of you coming maybe in for the game. This applies to you as much as it applies to the people who are here every Sunday. A life of stewardship ultimately is a life of gratitude. When we live a life of stewardship, we are aware of all that God has given us, and then we spend our lives responding to God's goodness. And we do that in, we would say, 3 ways. We do that with our time, which is our life of prayer. How much time do I give to God? I think I can say with a high degree of confidence for the whole church here today, we can do better. I need to spend more time with the Lord. I need to spend more time in prayer, thanking the Lord for what He's done, asking the Lord for things that I need. We can all spend more time. The second piece of a stewardship way of life is our talents. What gifts has God given me? What talents do I bring to the life of this parish and to the life of our community? What talents do I have? What gifts do I bring? For some of you, maybe you're saying to yourself, well, I don't really have a lot of talent. Well, maybe you have time. Some of you don't have any time, but you have a lot of talent, right? It's a mix. It's the reason that we do this stewardship renewal every year, because your life has changed since last year. Maybe you have more time, maybe you have less. Maybe you have a different talent this year that you're ready to give that you didn't last year or the year before. So every year, we ask you, what are those things that you bring in the area of time, in the area of talent? And then third, in the area of treasure. What God has given us in the material goods of our life, how do we then respond to God's goodness? By putting our treasure into the life of the parish, into the life of our community, in order to help with the evangelization of Payne County, the goal of our parish, or to help those who are in need. It's a life of gratitude, ultimately. One of the lepers came back. That's the one we want to be like. But if we're honest, oftentimes we're like the other 9. Now, I want to connect this to what we're doing here today, which is we've come here to the Holy Mass. The very word Eucharist that we receive, that we're in the presence of, the word Eucharist means thanksgiving. It's an opportunity to receive a gift from Almighty God and then to spend our lives in service to God, giving that gift to others. The Eucharist means thanksgiving, but there's a very particular part of the Mass that I want to point out to you. Sometimes, we come to Mass and maybe our heads are somewhere else, our hearts are somewhere else, and so sometimes the Mass can kind of come and go. The words of the Mass can kind of fly right by us. But there's a part kind of right in the middle of the Mass, after the homily, after the creed, after the prayers of the faithful, the gifts get brought up, we take up a collection, we move to the altar, and the celebrant, the priest, he prays what we call the preface. We do it every time. The priest will say or sing, "The Lord be with you." And the people respond, "And with your spirit." The priest, the celebrant, then says, "Lift up your hearts." The people respond, "We lift them up to the Lord." The priest then says, "Let us give thanks to the Lord our God." And you respond with one of the great lines of the Mass. And maybe it flies right by you every week and you've never given it an ounce of thought. The priest says, let us give thanks to the Lord our God. And you say, it is right and just. To give thanks is right and just. It's right, it's correct, it's truth, it's good, and it's just, meaning that we owe it to God. We owe gratitude to God. And so a life of stewardship is not meant to be a life of sort of guilt. All right, everybody, we got to pay the light bill. Everybody pony up. Let's go. All right, guys, we need some more volunteers for this or for that. Right? We need somebody to cover adoration. We need somebody to read at Mass. And we're just going to guilt you and guilt you and guilt you until somebody signs up. That's not what we're trying to do. It's rather a response to God's goodness. One leper came back to say thanks. Let's be the one. 9 of them went off and we don't know where they went. Let's not be the 9. Let's be people whose hearts are filled with such gratitude for all that God has done for us. It is right and it is just.